In the blistering heat of the Persian Gulf, sitting on a mudflat in the Shat al-Arab waterway, stood the single most valuable piece of real estate in the British Empire. It was not a gold mine in South Africa. It was not a tea plantation in India. It was a sprawling tangle of steel pipes, cooling towers, and smokestacks known as the Abadan refinery. In 1951, this facility was the largest oil refinery on the planet. It covered a square mile of desert. It processed 25 million tons of crude oil a year. And every single drop of that oil, every penny of profit generated by the black blood pumping through those pipes, belonged to a company called the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. To the British government, sitting 4,000 miles away in the grey drizzle of London Abadan was not just an industrial asset. It was a life support machine. The British Empire had emerged from the Second World War victorious but destitute. The national treasury was empty, drained to pay for the fight against Hitler. The country was drowning in debt owed to the United States. The British people were living on rations, eating powdered eggs, and wearing utility clothing. The only thing keeping the British economy from total collapse was the hard currency earned by its overseas assets. And by far the biggest earner was Iranian oil. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which we know today as BP, was essentially a state within a state. It generated millions of pounds in revenue that flowed directly into the British exchequer. It fueled the Royal Navy. It provided the energy for the factories of the Midlands. It was the financial lung that allowed a shrinking empire to keep breathing. But there was a problem. This massive engine of wealth was located in a country that was waking up. Iran was an ancient civilization with a proud history, but for the first half of the 20th century, it had been treated as little more than a colonial resource extraction zone. The British ran the oil industry in Iran with a level of arrogance that is difficult to comprehend today. In Abadan, the British administrators lived in a segregated enclave that looked like an English suburb. They had cricket pitches, manicured lawns, swimming pools, and air-conditioned bungalows. They imported their food from London. They drank gin and tonics on verandas, while just outside the fence, the Iranian workers lived in shanty towns made of flattened oil drums. There was no running water. There was no electricity. The heat was unbearable, often reaching 120 degrees. The workers were paid pennies. They had no rights. They were treated as coolies in their own country. The injustice was mathematical. In 1950 alone, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company made a profit of £170 million. They paid the Iranian government less than £16 million in royalties. The British government collected more in taxes from the company than the Iranian government received for its own natural resource. For decades, the Iranians had simmered with resentment. But in 1951, that resentment boiled over into a revolution. And the face of that revolution was a man named Mohammad Mosaddegh. Mosaddegh was an aristocrat, a lawyer, and a passionate nationalist. He was an elderly man, frail, often prone to fainting spells and fits of weeping in public. He wore pajamas to diplomatic meetings. The British diplomats dismissed him as a hysteric, a clown, a madman. They made fun of his long nose and his emotional speeches, but they underestimated him completely. Mosaddegh was a brilliant politician who understood the one thing the British had forgotten: the power of dignity. Mosaddegh argued a simple point. The oil under the Iranian soil belonged to the Iranian people. It was a gift from God to the nation, not a dividend for shareholders in London. He demanded that the books be opened. He demanded a fair split of the profits, 50-50, similar to the deal American oil companies had recently signed with Saudi Arabia. The British refused. The chairman of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, Sir William Fraser, was a man of the old imperial school. He believed that the Iranians were incapable of running the industry. He believed that any concession would be a sign of weakness. He treated the Iranian government like a rebellious employee. He refused to negotiate. He refused to open the books. He believed that if he just held firm, the Iranians would back down because they needed the British technicians to run the complex machinery of the refinery. Fraser's arrogance was the match that lit the fuse. On March 15, 1951, the Iranian parliament, the Majlis, voted unanimously to nationalize the oil industry. A few weeks later, they elected Mohammad Mosaddegh as the new prime minister. The news hit London like a seismic shock. It was the unthinkable. A third world nation had simply seized the greatest asset of the British crown. It wasn't just a theft. It was a humiliation. It was a signal to the world that the British lion was toothless. In the cabinet room at number 10 Downing Street, the Labour government of Clement Attlee was paralyzed. They were terrified. They knew what this meant financially. If they lost the oil revenue, the British pound would collapse. The standard of living in Britain, which was already austere, would crash to third world levels. They would not be able to afford to import food. The British military chiefs drew up plans for an invasion. They called it Operation Buccaneer. They planned to seize the island of Abadan by force, using paratroopers and marines to secure the refinery and the oil fields. They wanted to do what empires had always done when the natives got restless: send in the gunboats. But the Treasury officials looked at the plan and shook their heads. They told the Prime Minister the brutal truth. We cannot afford a war. An invasion would cost millions. It would require occupying a country the size of Western Europe. It would turn the entire Muslim world against Britain. And most importantly, the United States wouldn't support it. President Harry Truman was bogged down in the Korean War. He didn't want another conflict in the Middle East. He warned the British that if they invaded Iran, he would not back them up. Without American money, Britain couldn't fight. The gunboats stayed in the harbor. Operation Buccaneer was shelved. So instead of an invasion, Britain launched an economic war. If they couldn't take the oil by force, they would make sure that no one else could have it. They organized a total blockade of Iranian oil. The Royal Navy patrolled the Persian Gulf. They announced that any tanker trying to buy Iranian oil would be treated as a buyer of stolen property. They threatened legal action against any company in the world that dared to touch Iranian crude. They froze Iranian assets in British banks. They stopped exporting steel and sugar to Iran. The British engineers and managers at Abadan were ordered to leave. In a scene of immense national drama, the British staff boarded the cruiser HMS Mauritius and sailed away. The refinery, the largest in the world, fell silent. The pipes dried up. The storage tanks were full, but the tap was closed. Britain was trying to strangle Iran into submission. They believed that without oil revenue, the Iranian economy would collapse, the people would starve, and they would overthrow Mosaddegh and beg the British to return. But Mosaddegh refused to break. He told his people that they would rather be poor and free than rich and enslaved. He called it an economy without oil. He issued bonds. He asked the people to endure hardship for the sake of sovereignty. And the Iranian people responded. They rallied around him. He became a hero, not just in Iran, but across the developing world. He was the man who had stood up to the British Empire. In October 1951, Winston Churchill returned to power as Prime Minister. Churchill was 77 years old. He was a man of the 19th century living in the nuclear age. He was the man who had personally converted the Royal Navy from coal to oil back in 1913. He viewed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company not just as a business, but as his child. He saw the loss of Abadan not as a financial dispute, but as a personal insult. Churchill wanted blood. He hated the idea of being bullied by a man in pajamas. He ranted to his cabinet about the need to show strength. He wanted to dust off the invasion plans. He wanted to send the paratroopers. But the economic reality had not changed. The British economy was still on life support. The gold reserves were dwindling. The Americans were still saying no to war. Churchill, the great warrior, realized with a bitter taste in his mouth that he was the leader of a second-rate power. He could not order the fleet to sail because he couldn't pay for the fuel. Churchill realized he needed a different kind of weapon. If he couldn't use the army, he had to use the shadows. He had to use spies. The British intelligence service MI6 began to plot a coup. They had a network of agents in Iran inside the military, the press, and the bazaars. They codenamed the Operation Boot. The plan was to use bribery and propaganda to create chaos in Tehran, to turn the people against Mosaddegh, and to install a pro-British general in his place. But there was a snag. In 1952, Mosaddegh discovered the plot. He realized the British embassy in Tehran was a nest of spies. In a bold move, he expelled all British diplomats from Iran. He kicked them out. MI6 lost its eyes and ears on the ground. Their network was headless. They couldn't run a coup from London. They needed someone inside Tehran to hand out the cash and give the orders. Churchill knew there was only one way to get back into Iran. He needed the Americans. He needed the CIA. But President Truman was still in the White House, and Truman had no interest in overthrowing a democratically elected leader just to save a British oil monopoly. Truman saw Mosaddegh as a nationalist, not a communist. He sympathized with the Iranians' desire to control their own resources. As long as Truman was president, the British were stuck. But time was on Churchill's side. In November 1952, the United States elected a new president, Dwight D. Eisenhower. And more importantly, Eisenhower appointed two brothers to the key positions of power. John Foster Dulles became Secretary of State, and Allen Dulles became the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. The Dulles brothers were cold warriors. They saw the world in black and white. They saw a global chessboard where every move was a struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. Churchill saw his opening. He knew he couldn't sell a coup to the Americans based on saving the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The Americans didn't care about British profits. In fact, American oil companies were quite happy to see the British monopoly broken. So Churchill changed the narrative. He stopped talking about oil and started talking about communism. He sent his best diplomats and spies to Washington. They spun a terrifying story to the Dulles brothers. They claimed that Mosaddegh was weak. They claimed that as the British blockade destroyed the Iranian economy, the country was sliding into chaos. They argued that in this chaos, the two-day party, the Iranian Communist Party, would seize power. They painted a nightmare scenario. Iran would fall behind the Iron Curtain. The Soviet Union would gain control of the Persian Gulf. They would control the warm water ports they had sought for centuries. They would control the oil supply of the West. It's not about our money, the British lied. It's about your security. If you don't act now, Tehran will be Moscow by Christmas. It was a masterful piece of manipulation. Churchill played on American paranoia. He used the fear of the Red Menace to get the Americans to do the dirty work of the British Empire. Eisenhower and the Dulles brothers bought it. They were terrified of a Soviet Iran. They agreed to a joint operation. The CIA would take the lead with MI6 providing the intelligence and the contacts. They renamed the plan. Operation Boot became Operation Ajax. The budget was set, $1 million. $1 million to overthrow a government and steal an oil industry worth billions. It was the highest return on investment in the history of espionage. The man chosen to run the operation was Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt. He was a romantic figure, a quintessential American spy. In the summer of 1953, he slipped into Iran across the border from Iraq. He carried a fake passport in a suitcase. Inside the suitcase was not a bomb or a radio. It was cash, stacks of Iranian rials and US dollars. The British had failed to invade with soldiers. They had failed to starve the country with sanctions. Now they were going to try the oldest trick in the book. They were going to buy a revolution. Kermit Roosevelt arrived in a Tehran that was a powder keg. The British blockade had done its work. The economy was collapsing. Inflation was rampant. The middle class was wiping out. The people who had cheered Mosaddegh 2 years ago were now hungry and anxious. The unity of the nationalist movement was fraying. The stage was set. The script was written. The actors, generals, gangsters, journalists, and clerics, were waiting in the wings for their payment. Churchill sat in London smoking his cigar, waiting for the telegram that would tell him the gamble had paid off. He knew that this was the last roll of the dice for British power in the Middle East. If the coup failed, the British Empire was finished in the region. If it succeeded, they might just get their oil back. But as Kermit Roosevelt opened his suitcase in a safe house in Tehran, he wasn't just unleashing a coup. He was unleashing a ghost. He was about to start a chain reaction that would destroy the democratic hopes of a nation, radicalize a generation, and eventually lead to the very Islamic revolution that the West fears today. The British wanted their dividend. They were about to purchase a 50-year nightmare. In the sweltering August of 1953, the fate of the British Empire in the Middle East rested in the hands of a single American spy sitting in a basement in Tehran. Kermit Roosevelt Jr. had arrived with a mission that was ostensibly political to stop communism, but was, in reality, purely financial, to recover the stolen assets of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. He had a budget of $1 million, cash, a network of paid agitators, and a plan that relied less on military strategy than on theatrical chaos. The operation codenamed Ajax was designed to look like a popular uprising. It was a fake revolution purchased by the barrel. Roosevelt began by bribing the Iranian press. He handed out thick envelopes of cash to newspaper editors and columnists. Overnight, the Tehran papers began to print vicious attacks on Prime Minister Mosaddegh. They called him an atheist, a Jew, a British agent, and a communist spy all at the same time. The contradictions didn't matter. The goal was confusion. Then Roosevelt turned to the streets. He hired gang leaders from the Zurkhaneh, the traditional Persian houses of strength. These were muscle men, weightlifters, and wrestlers who commanded local respect and fear. For a few $100s, they agreed to organize mobs. Roosevelt hired one mob to shout, "Long live Mosaddegh," and smash shop windows and beat up pedestrians. Then he hired another mob to attack the first mob, shouting, "Long live the Shah." The idea was to create a sense of total anarchy, to make the ordinary citizens of Tehran terrified of Mossadegh's rule. The British agents, who were still communicating with Roosevelt from the shadows, provided the intelligence on which generals could be bought and which clerics could be persuaded to preach against the government. But the coup had a mechanical trigger. It required the Shah of Iran, the young and indecisive monarch, to sign 2 royal decrees. One decree dismissed Mosaddegh as prime minister. The other appointed General Fazlollah Zahedi, a Nazi sympathizer and British asset, in his place. The Shah was terrified. He knew Mosaddegh was popular. He knew that if the coup failed, he would lose his throne. He hesitated. He packed his bags ready to flee at a moment's notice. To stiffen his spine, the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, played a crucial role. It was the voice of London, and in 1953 it was weaponized. The Shah had agreed to sign the decrees only if he received a specific signal confirming that the British government was behind the plan. The signal was to be broadcast on the BBC Persian service. Usually at midnight, the announcer would say, "It is now midnight." On the night of the coup, the announcer was instructed to say, "It is now exactly midnight." The Shah heard the extra word. He signed the decrees. On the night of August 15th, the coup began. An officer loyal to the Shah, the colonel of the Imperial Guard, drove to Mossadegh's house to arrest him. But Mosaddegh had been tipped off. The Tudeh party network had infiltrated the military, and they knew the coup was coming. When the colonel arrived, he didn't find a sleeping prime minister. He found himself surrounded by loyal pro-Mossaddegh troops and tanks. The arrest failed. The colonel was captured. The coup had collapsed before it even started. Panic swept through the conspirators. The Shah, hearing the news, fled the country instantly. He flew his private plane first to Baghdad and then to Rome, where he sat in a hotel lobby depressed and convinced he would never see Iran again. In Washington, the CIA was horrified. They sent a telegram to Kermit Roosevelt ordering him to evacuate immediately. "Operation failed," the message read. "Get out while you can." But Roosevelt ignored the order. He was a gambler. He realized that while the military part of the coup had failed, the psychological part was still in play. He decided to double down. He decided to run the coup again, but this time he wouldn't use the army. He would use the mob. For the next 3 days, Roosevelt flooded Tehran with cash. He emptied his safe. He paid anyone who could hold a stick or a rock. He organized massive demonstrations. He paid fake communists to attack mosques, knowing this would enrage the religious population. He paid clerics to declare a holy war against the government. On August 19th, the second wave hit. It was a tsunami of paid violence. Thousands of protesters marched on the government buildings. They burned the offices of the newspapers that supported Mosaddegh. They attacked the police stations. Crucially, the army units that had remained neutral began to switch sides. They saw the momentum shifting. General Zahedi, who had been hiding in a CIA safe house, emerged riding atop a tank. The final battle took place at 109 Cox Street, the home of Prime Minister Mosaddegh. It was a brutal, intimate siege. Pro-Shah tanks blasted the gates of the house. Mossadegh's loyal guards fought back with machine guns and bazookas. For hours, the street was a war zone. Hundreds were killed. The house was pounded into rubble. Finally, with his ammunition gone and his roof collapsing, Mosaddegh surrendered. He walked out of the ruins of his home, an old man in pajamas who had dared to tell the British Empire that Iran was not a gas station. He was arrested. The radio station was seized. The announcer declared, "The government of Mosaddegh has been crushed. Long live the Shah." In Rome, the Shah was eating lunch when he heard the news. He turned pale. "I knew they loved me," he reportedly said. He flew back to Tehran in triumph, greeted by the very generals who had sold out his country. In London, Winston Churchill was ecstatic. He lit a fresh cigar. The gamble had paid off. The thief had been caught. The oil was safe. The British Empire had proven it could still topple governments and dictate terms to the Third World. But when the dust settled and the bankers arrived to divide the spoils, the British received a nasty shock. They had launched the coup to save the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. They wanted their monopoly back. They wanted to return to the days when they owned 100% of Iranian oil. But the Americans, who had done the heavy lifting, who had paid the bribes and organized the mobs, had a different idea. The United States government told Churchill bluntly that the old monopoly was dead. The days of exclusive British colonialism were over. If the Iranian oil industry was going to be restarted, it had to be an international consortium. The deal that was signed in 1954 was a humiliation for Britain, masked as a victory. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was renamed British Petroleum BP, but it was forced to give up 40% of its stake to a group of American oil giants, including Standard Oil and Texaco. Another 14% went to the Dutch and the French. Britain retained only 40% of the asset it had once owned completely. Churchill had won the battle for Tehran, but he had lost the war for dominance. He had invited the American fox into the British henhouse. The coup marked the definitive end of British supremacy in the Middle East and the beginning of the American era. The United States was no longer just a spectator in the region. It was now the landlord. The financial cost of the operation was $1 million. It was arguably the most efficient investment in the history of covert action. For $1 million, the West secured 25 years of cheap oil. The profits flowed again. The British Treasury was replenished. The dividends were paid. The crisis was over. But the real bill for the coup would not come due for another 25 years, and it would not be paid in money. By overthrowing a democratic, secular, nationalist leader, the British and Americans destroyed the political center of Iran. Mosaddegh was not a communist. He was a liberal who wanted a constitution. By crushing him, the West sent a clear message to the Iranian people: democratic change is impossible. If you want to change your country, you cannot use the ballot box because the CIA will just overturn it. This left only one avenue for opposition: the mosque. The Shah, restored to his throne, became a dictator. He was paranoid, knowing that he owed his crown to foreigners, not his own people. He created a secret police force known as Savak, trained by the CIA and the Israeli Mossad. Savak became notorious for its brutality. They hunted down communists, liberals, and anyone who whispered a word against the king. For 2 decades, the Shah ruled with an iron fist, fueled by the oil wealth that flowed from the new consortium. He modernized Iran, building highways and universities, but the wealth stayed at the top. The corruption was grotesque. The resentment grew. And in the mosques, the clerics began to tell a story. They told the story of 1953. They told the story of how the great Satan, America, and the old fox, Britain, had stolen the country's dignity. They turned Mossadegh into a martyr, not of liberalism, but of resistance. The leader of this religious opposition was an exile named Ayatollah Khomeini. In 1979, the bill finally arrived. The Iranian Revolution swept the Shah from power. It was a revolution fueled by the delayed rage of 1953, when the students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 52 American diplomats hostage. They weren't just angry about the Shah's cancer treatment. They were angry about Kermit Roosevelt. They were angry about the coup. They were refighting the battle of 1953, but this time they won. The loss of Iran in 1979 was a geopolitical catastrophe for the West. It created an enemy regime that haunts the region to this day. It led to the Iran-Iraq War, the rise of Hezbollah, and the nuclear standoff we face now. All of this can be traced back to the decision made in London in 1951 to prioritize the balance sheet of an oil company over the sovereignty of a nation. Winston Churchill believed he was saving the British economy. In the short term, he did. The oil money kept the welfare state afloat for another decade. It allowed Britain to pretend it was a superpower for a little while longer. But the price was the moral standing of the West. The coup proved that for all the talk of democracy and freedom when money was on the line, the British Empire was nothing more than a debt collection agency with a spy network. The oil heist was the last gasp of the old imperial way of doing business. It was a tactical success and a strategic disaster. It taught the world that resources are a curse, and that the hand that feeds you today might strangle you tomorrow if the profit margin drops. Britain lost its oil monopoly in 1954. It lost its influence in 1979, but it lost its honor in that basement in Tehran in 1953. The millions of pounds earned by BP in the intervening years were spent long ago, but the hatred sown in those hot August days is still yielding a bitter harvest. This concludes the story of how Britain lost Iran. It is a story of how a desperate bankrupt empire tried to steal a future it could not afford and ended up paying a price that the whole world is still settling today. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.